Good afternoon. There was some, I think, expected and not unusual misunderstanding or miscommunication between the organization and some of the speakers. In part, it was suggested to me that my role here would be one of simply provoking a workshop into discussion. I tend to find that physical spaces are very important when you try to achieve certain intellectual aims, and I don't think that everybody sitting facing the front is going to be very conducive to an internal debate among the people present here. In truth, if this was to function as I expected it to be, as a consultation process out of brainstorming, I'm not sure that that's exactly what is going to come out of this. The guidelines that we received as keynote speakers to address particular issues, for example, I found, without being ungrateful for the invitation, somewhat redundant, in as much as many of the aspects that were put as questions, perhaps rhetorically, have already been addressed in legislation that has already been passed, and I'm not quite sure what the point is of asking them again. So I took very literally the invitation that was put to me, which was to address some of the issues of perceptions of Europe and see whether that can generate some discussion that feeds into the process of the forum as such, as a whole. I already mentioned to my colleagues, moderators and speakers at the briefing meeting that we had, that I find somewhat problematic the division of labor that has been set up, although I understand in practical terms its need, between the workshops 1, 2, and 3, and between 1 and 3 in particular, with one focused on inter-cultural dialogue as some sort of internal dimension, and then workshop 3 focused on the international dimension of European relations with the outside world. I'm not quite sure how you can do intercultural dialogue within Europe without taking into account the spillages from outside, the transversal relations and transnational ones. So that is perhaps something that I would welcome our rapporteur carrying on to the syntheses that he will be responsible for. Now, I understand as well that the rapporteur's function is to actually be able to take something constructive out of these meetings, but I think that perhaps the keynote speaker's function must be somewhat disruptive of that. If it is to truly push for some discussion, it can't simply go with the easy notions of the points to be made and synthesized. Now, I take it that I am a lecturer at university, and I know both the extremely limited attention spans of people as well as the limitations of a multiple assault on the senses. Now, at the same time, I'm not sure what the point is of talking about culture without letting artistic expression do some of that talking, and without at the same time conveying some of the notion of where culture is happening at. For example, I would say that one of the means of cultural sharing that is most common, well, at least for my generation, the younger generation already uses all sorts of Facebooks and things that I'm not so familiar with, but YouTube is certainly one of the means of sharing cultural products that is very disseminated, and I will make use of that here. I also want to, in particular, problematize, if there is something that is to come out of this, in line with what I said about the relation between workshops 1 and 3, is the question of inside and outside in perceptions. And I hope that, despite the fact that you have to listen to what I'm saying, you've also been catching some of the images and the contrast between screens 1 and 2, and that is trying to say something as well. Now, it is the case, as we all agree, and the European Union's policies are all already predicated on this, that active citizenship requires a cultural dimension. Very well. This cultural dimension, however, requires not, as one usual refrain would have it, drawing on a common cultural heritage, much less a past one. But it's also not about simply forging a culture to come. It is more the process itself of actively participating in culture making, which must include as well what the meaning of culture is. So not only the forging of cultures as a process that actively involves people, but which actually transforms and widens and reinvents the notion of culture itself. Now, the European Cultural Foundation final report of 2005, Europe as a Cultural Project, perfectly captures one aspect of this if we take the notion cultural project to mean an open-ended and future orientation. At the same time, though, if we're really serious about taking that notion at its letter, that perhaps begs the question of Europe in the title, Europe as a Cultural Project. If the cultural project is open-ended and future-oriented, what exactly does Europe mean there? Culture forged in Europe as a territorial space? Culture forged by Europeans? Culture which refers to Europe? Culture done by Europeans elsewhere? Now, both culture and Europe, I suggest rather banally, are discursive engines of war, including that war by other means, which is diplomacy. Now, in considering the integration process in which this cultural dimension of Europe is played out, it is useful, I think, to recall James Tully's mapping of the three articulated levels that are at play. Multiculturalism, that is citizens and minorities. Multinationalism, that is the member states and their national cultures. And multi-civilizationism, the diverse civilizations of individuals, minorities, and majorities. Now, obviously, there are different levels of territorialization and deterritorialization going on in these three different dimensions. Now, again, as the European Cultural Foundation report is to the point, it reminds us that Europe is as much the signifier of memories of common resistances and sufferings as it is made up of contentious memories of antagonisms, and that therefore forgetfulness and forgiveness, as much as memory, is required to forge Europe as an aspiration for the future rather than more than as an inheritance from the past. Now, one aspect of this process of negotiating past and present requires a rather more conscious process of truth and reconciliation than simply forgetting and moving on. It also speaks to the twin dimensions of the foregrounding of the cultural turn that has taken place in the integration process. The expression blackening Europe can serve us here as shorthand for a first cluster of issues. At the level of heritage, this comprises in the first place the reconfiguration of a whitewashed European past, and secondly, that of the cultural stakeholding of ethnically diverse European citizens in the present. It also requires a closer look at the cultural collections that make up the universality of European culture, something that we heard the ambassador also refer to this morning, facing up to the colonial histories of collections and archives and confronting the thorny issue of restitution.